It's been months since my grandfather passed away, but the sting still hasn't faded. I'll never forget that day. The day the world as I knew it completely unraveled. The day I found out that everything I thought I had worked for, everything I thought I would inherit, was gone. It was all taken away by the woman who had never been my mother, my stepmother, Clarissa. To say it felt like a punch to the gut would be an understatement. It was more like I'd been knocked out cold, left reeling on the floor, and unsure of who I could trust. I had always been close to Grandpa. He was the one person who treated me like I mattered, unlike my absentee father, who'd barely been around since I could remember. Grandpa had always promised me the family estate, the land, the house, everything. It was supposed to be mine. Clarissa, on the other hand, had been nothing but a thorn in my side ever since she married my dad. It wasn't just the way she insisted on calling herself my second mom when I never asked for a second mom. It was the way she'd always undermine me, constantly belittling me, dismissing my ideas, making sure I knew she was the one in charge now. She'd try to be friendly at first, like she was doing me a favor, but I always saw through it. Her kindness was a mask for her manipulation. When Grandpa died, the entire family gathered for the reading of his will. My heart raced as the lawyer went through the formalities. I had every reason to believe Grandpa would leave me everything. His old house, his farm, the land he'd owned for decades. It was my birthright. But then, the lawyer dropped the bombshell, and the primary beneficiary of the estate, including the family home, assets, and land, is Mrs. Clarissa Hayes. The words echoed in my ears. I couldn't breathe. I blinked repeatedly, hoping I had heard wrong, but it didn't matter how many times I rewound those words in my mind. Clarissa was the heir to everything. My grandfather, the man I had trusted and loved, had betrayed me. In his final moments, the room went quiet. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt my hands begin to tremble. Clarissa, sitting across the table, gave me a smug little smile, as if she had won some great battle. My father, who had been largely absent from my life, didn't even seem surprised. His eyes met mine for a second, but there was no empathy there, just an apathetic shrug. I stood up, my voice shaking with fury. "This is a mistake. Grandpa would never have done this. He promised me everything." Clarissa, in that calm, condescending tone of hers, said, "Your grandfather was very clear about his wishes, and I've respected them. I don't know what you were expecting, but sometimes life doesn't work out the way we think it should." I could feel my entire body trembling with rage. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to tear apart every piece of paper in front of me. But what could I do? The will was legal, and Clarissa, she was untouchable now, wrapped in the authority of her new inheritance. I left that day with nothing but anger and confusion swirling inside me. How could this be happening? How had Clarissa turned everything around so that she was the one in control? I thought about all the times Grandpa had told me that the estate would be mine one day. I thought about all the years I'd spent looking up to him, learning from him, thinking that I was going to carry on the family legacy. And now, it was all slipping through my fingers. But as I walked out of that lawyer's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There had to be a reason why Grandpa had left everything to Clarissa. I didn't know what it was, but I was determined to find out. I couldn't let her have everything without a fight. The truth had to be out there somewhere, hidden in the shadows. I wasn't going to let her steal my inheritance without uncovering the last laugh Grandpa had hidden in his will. And so, my search began. The days after the will reading passed in a blur of frustration and disbelief. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my head. Clarissa sitting there smugly, watching me as if she had won some sort of sick game. The more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no way Grandpa would have left everything to her without a reason. I had to find that reason. It wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about proving to myself that Grandpa hadn't forgotten me, that he hadn't let her destroy everything he'd worked for. I started going through Grandpa's things. I'd been to his house hundreds of times before, but now it felt different. I was looking for something hidden, something that could explain what had happened. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as I rummaged through drawers and old filing cabinets. His study, where he'd always spent hours working, seemed untouched by time. The old leather chair sat by the window, still covered in his thick wool blanket. I felt the sting of nostalgia, but I pushed it aside. This was about more than memories. It was about finding answers. I started with his desk. I opened drawers, flipping through old papers, but nothing seemed out of place. bills, old tax forms, receipts for farm supplies. Then, in the very back drawer, hidden beneath a pile of clutter, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. A thick manila envelope, sealed with a wax stamp I hadn't seen in years. The seal was old, worn with time, but still intact. It looked like something Grandpa would use, his signature touch. I carefully opened the envelope, feeling the weight of anticipation pressing down on me. Inside, I found a series of handwritten letters, old and yellowed with age. Each one was addressed to my dearest Clarissa. The letters were filled with sweet words, too sweet, in fact. It was clear that Grandpa had cared for her deeply, but there was something else in those letters, something I hadn't expected. Mentions of a secret between them, our shared life, the future we will build, and other words that made my stomach twist. The letters weren't just sentimental, they were personal, too personal. Then, at the very bottom of the envelope, I found a separate, folded piece of paper. It was different from the rest. This one was typed, and in a much more official tone. I read it quickly, my eyes scanning the words, before I realized what I was holding. A second will. The shock hit me like a wave, cold and unrelenting. Grandpa hadn't left everything to Clarissa outright. There was a clause, buried within the fine print, that I hadn't noticed. A clause that would have meant the world to me if I had only known about it. The will clearly stated that Clarissa would inherit everything, unless I proved myself worthy. The entire inheritance, every cent of it, was contingent on a condition I never thought to check. Grandpa had set up a challenge for me, a final test. It wasn't just money and property he wanted to pass on. He wanted to make sure I was ready for it, ready to take on the responsibility of the family legacy. And Clarissa, she had no idea. I could hardly believe it. Clarissa had thought she had it all, that the estate was hers for the taking, but I had the upper hand now. The ball was in my court. All I needed to do was prove that I could meet Grandpa's final challenge. But what was it? What exactly did I need to do? I turned the letter over, scanning the rest of the text. There, written in bold, unmistakable letters, was the answer. To inherit the family legacy, you must reclaim what is rightfully yours and prove your ability to lead. It was vague, cryptic even, but it was enough to spark a fire in me. This wasn't just about the money. It was about proving to myself that I was capable, that I could stand up to Clarissa and take back what was mine. The realization hit me like a freight train. I was not going to let her walk away with everything. I had a chance to fix this, to turn the tables and come out on top, but I would need to be smart. I couldn't let her know what I had found. Not yet. Clarissa would have to pay for what she did. But first, I needed to understand what Grandpa had set in motion. I had a feeling this challenge was going to be much more than I'd ever imagined. It had been weeks since the reading of Grandpa's will, but I still couldn't wrap my mind around it. My stepmother, Clarissa, was the heir to everything. She had stolen my inheritance right under my nose, and no one seemed to care. Grandpa had promised me the estate, the land, the family business. It was supposed to be my legacy, but now it was hers. I was angry, hurt, and betrayed, but something nagged at me. There had to be more to this than I could see. I wasn't wrong. It took me some time, but I found what I was looking for. An old wax-sealed envelope hidden at the back of Grandpa's desk, tucked beneath piles of old papers. It wasn't just a letter. It was a second will. A second will that contained a clause I hadn't known about. Clarissa had thought she had everything wrapped up, but she didn't. Grandpa had set a condition, an obstacle course that I had to pass before the inheritance would be mine. I wasn't just inheriting a house or some money. I was inheriting the responsibility to lead, to take over the family legacy. If I could prove I was worthy, the words burned in my mind as I processed the shock. To inherit the family legacy, you must reclaim what is rightfully yours and prove your ability to lead. It was vague, but it was enough to give me hope. Clarissa had no idea about the second will. She thought the inheritance was already hers, and I wasn't going to let her have it. I knew I had to move fast, but I also knew I couldn't let her catch wind of the truth. The challenge had been set. The clock was ticking. I started looking into Grandpa's business, his investments, his contacts. It wasn't just about the property. Grandpa had built something bigger than that, a network, a foundation for the future. His company was a cornerstone of the community, and now it was up to me to prove that I could handle it. I needed to learn everything about it, even if it meant working long nights going through the business files and speaking to people who had worked with him for years. Clarissa had no clue. She spent her days lounging by the pool, sipping margaritas, thinking she had everything she wanted. Her arrogance worked in my favor. I kept a low profile, going about my research, while Clarissa flaunted her supposed victory. It felt like playing chess, only I wasn't sure if I was winning or losing just yet. But then, something unexpected happened. A phone call from one of Grandpa's old business partners brought everything into focus. He had been told by Grandpa years ago that the company would eventually be handed over to me, but there was a catch. The partners had been waiting for me to step up, to show that I could take the reins. I realized Grandpa had been preparing me all along, but in a way that wasn't obvious. He wanted me to prove myself, not just to him, but to everyone else who had been involved with the business for decades. With this knowledge, I knew what I had to do. Clarissa had been playing a game with me, but I wasn't going to let her win. I called a meeting with all the key players involved in Grandpa's company, those who had worked alongside him for years. It was time to show them that I wasn't just some kid who had been left behind. I had earned my place, and it was time for them to see it. The meeting didn't go the way Clarissa thought it would. She was shocked when I announced I was taking over the business. She tried to argue, tried to convince everyone that I wasn't capable, that I didn't know the ins and outs of the company. But Grandpa's partners saw through her. They remembered Grandpa's vision, and they remembered who had been there, who had paid attention, who had listened. They all sided with me. Clarissa tried to fight back, but her game was over. The partners had seen enough. They knew that I was the one who could lead the company forward. I had proven myself, but Clarissa wasn't finished yet. As she stormed out of the meeting, I knew she would fight me in other ways, through lawyers, through manipulation, whatever it took. But I was ready for her. The final blow came when I was handed the deed to the house, the family estate. It wasn't just the house that mattered. It was the legacy, the symbol of everything Grandpa had worked for. I could finally say I had reclaimed what was mine. The will had been more than just a piece of paper. It had been Grandpa's last lesson to me, to fight for what's rightfully mine, to prove my worth, and to step up when the time came. As I walked through the old house, now officially mine, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Clarissa had lost the inheritance, the business, the estate. They were all mine, and with them came responsibility. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be obstacles, but I also knew that Grandpa had believed in me. That belief was the final gift he had given me. Clarissa didn't give up easily. She tried to bring the fight to court, hoping the legal system would side with her, but it didn't. The truth of Grandpa's second will was clear, and I had proved that I was the one who could continue his legacy. My life had changed in ways I never could have imagined, but one thing was certain. I was no longer the person I was before. Grandpa had given me more than an inheritance. He had given me the strength to lead, and as for Clarissa, she was left with nothing but her own bitterness. The last laugh, as it turned out, belonged to Grandpa, and I was going to make sure that his legacy lived on, no matter what.